Starting up now. And we're ready to go. So Ryan, do you want to moderate? I can get things started, or you have any opening comments?
Sure, yeah, I'll just go over some of the highlights. There's been a lot of good stuff going in, which I think makes a PyIceberg and Java release more important. So it'll be good to talk about those. But just starting off with the highlights, so there was a addition to the Flink sync to add a custom partitioner that distributes traffic by bucket and not just partition. So this helps balance the data a whole lot better across Flink tasks. I believe that the idea was rather than having potentially skewed partitions within buckets, just to ignore everything except the bucket partitions. Is that a fair summary, Stephen?
Yeah, that's correct. So in the past, people are using the key by to the hash distribution, but that doesn't result balanced distribution. If the, let's say, number of bucket is 60 and the number of paradigm is 60, that the key by just doesn't work well.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty nice optimization. So thanks for getting that in, and thanks to Sergio for contributing it. Also, want to say thanks to Bryan on the tabular side for pushing through and getting an Azure native FileIO working. We've tested the performance, and it's quite good with Azure, so that was really cool. And we also added AWS, GCP, and Azure bundles. So thanks, Bryan, for doing those. The AWS, GCP, and Azure bundles are a bit different. What we found was the other cloud providers, so GCP in particular, did not have an Uber bundle of all of their SDK dependencies. And so rather than making users go on a Spark command line or however they're deploying, go find all of those dependencies and bundle them themselves, we wanted to at least have an option for saying, okay, well, I'm using Spark runtime plus the GCP bundle, and knowing that you're getting everything that you need in there. So we went ahead and produced those for AWS and Azure as well. So that should make it a whole lot easier to use some of the different cloud services. Big thanks for that. By the way, we also named them bundles rather than runtimes because they actually bundle third-party dependencies, and they don't actually include Iceberg code. So that's the distinction that we're using, is bundle rather than runtime. The next, I want to say thanks to Anton for looking into a bunch of optimizations in the delete file job planning path. So these are things like realizing that when we have a delete file that affects multiple data files, the stats aren't actually helpful. And so we've removed the stats, so we will no longer write the stats for those files. And we've also, I believe, done some work to ignore those stats when we build the delete file index. So basically, if the lower bound and the upper bound for the affected data files are not the exact same file, in other words, if there are multiple data files, then we'll just ignore the stats to speed up job planning time considerably. Any other things I should mention there, Anton? I know you've been doing a lot of work in this area.
No, that's pretty the gist of it. There were like a few other things that were like that we caught up during the profiling, but all of it is related to how the delete planning is done. I think when we added this, we never profiled it. There was a lot of garbage being generated as well during the task group planning. So a lot of memory pressure. If you were running low in memory, that was causing like more issues. So I think those fixed, and we're like seeing 10x improvement in speed planning as well as the memory requirement.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. Thanks for working on that. And I believe you guys are also moving on to like the reads and like improving the actual task runtime as well, right?
yeah, we're looking into that as well. So there are more work to follow up on this, and it's just the first step. Whatever we've done is to enable the distributed planning in Spark and just to speed up local planning, but we still need to figure out how to the long-term vision for planning positional deletes and also applying them at the executor level.
Mm-hmm.
So we have some sort of cache as well as better indexing locally so that you don't assign false positive delete files as well.
Yeah. So really good to have those rolling in. I think that's really going to improve Spark performance. Because anecdotally, we've heard that the performance in Trino is way better than the performance in Spark when there are delete files present. So that's really cool. All right, next, I want to highlight some of what's been going on across the other parts of the community. So thanks to Fokko, we've been tracking towards an 0.5 release. And one of the big things there is moving to Pydantic v2, which was a pretty massive undertaking. We use Pydantic to serialize and deserialize almost all of the table metadata structures within the library, as well as for some of the conversion to JSON. So for the REST catalog. So really good to have that in. That's also going to unblock, as I understand it, the pollers support in with the 0.5 release. So that's a really cool thing to have out. Really quick one, ConeyLiu has been working on the Java implementation. Really happy with everything he's been doing. So he fixed, branching on empty tables and some of those things that were just lingering edge cases that we needed to fix. And has also been working on function pushdown in Spark, which is super cool. So I think hopefully for the 1.4 release, we're going to have a lot better function pushdown. So you'll be able to do things like filter a table and select a particular bucket if you want just a randomized subset of data, for example. So those are neat. Rust is progressing nicely. So we merged table metadata and deserialization. So thanks, Jan. And then Go, similarly, we've merged a PR with Schema and types. So really great to see both of those communities rolling and getting up to speed. I think if you're at all interested in being part of the Rust or Go communities, now is a really great time to go, review pull requests, ask questions, and get involved, because we could definitely use a lot more help, especially in reviews over on those languages. So really great to see all the progress here. Thanks, everyone. All right. I'll hand things off to Fokko to talk about the PyIceberg 0.5 release.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, we have a lot of stuff lined up already for the 0.5. Initially, it was the release that would bring like rights, but I think it's great to just do like an interim release because a lot of cool stuff in there. For example, support for gzip, which is also important if you write with other platforms and don't use the REST catalog. AZFS support for AWS lambdas to run like PyIceberg inside of a lambda, which I think is really cool. We have a lot of Avro improvements thanks to Rusty. And we also moved parts of the Avro parsing to Cython actually. And that also brings like a big change to the releases, because next to the source code, we also have to release like the binaries. So that's actually the Python wheels. So we also have to build them inside of GitHub Actions. So I have everything in place, but I think it's just good just to do another release before we also do all the right stuff. And other stuff like the JDBC catalog that's in there. I think it's just good to get this stuff out to the public. There's also, we've been working on schema evolution. And Levi did like the initial work, and I think it's good just to get like the full schema evolution in there. So I also create like a PR in there. It's massive, but it's mostly tests, so that's actually a good thing. But yeah, I think once that is in, then we can start the release process. If you have anything that you want to get in the release as well, just ping me or mention it in the Python Slack channel, and we can see if we can get it in as well.
Awesome. So the only known blocker is the schema evolution stuff and making sure that that's correct. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's one issue that was reported this week on Slack with installing like a specific set of dependencies that will take a long time to resolve. So I'm also looking into that just to see if we can fix that as well.
Awesome. Yeah, hopefully we can get that in. The next thing is I actually have not been here for another a couple weeks. But I think we've been discussing the Java 1.4 release. Has anyone volunteered to be release manager for a 1.4 release? Trying to look through the.
I think Anton did.
Okay, Anton. Well, I'll hand it off to you for to talk about blockers and what we want to get out.
Sure. I mean, Bryan and I would do the release together. Yeah, as far as 1.4 in Java, I think we're getting closer to that. There are a few things that I track specifically on my end, where I do the development or where I'm reviewing changes. I think read-to tables by default is the one that's that's really close to be in. Distributed planning in Spark, we've done multiple reviews and have resolved all of the blockers prior to this. So it's actually ready for another round. There are some basic tests. I'm working to add more tests, but we can start doing the detailed reviews. Z standard by default, it's also close to getting in. We've discussed this multiple times.
We think that's safe. Aren't there people still running? I mean, there are a lot of people still running deployments that don't support Z standard, right?
I don't think that's that common. We can discuss this a little bit more, but the consensus was that it's fairly adopted, and it's only will only be used for new tables, like the tables that you create. We will still respect the old JZ for the existing table. So if you created a table but you didn't specify the code, we will still respect whatever the old default we had. But for the new tables created now, we would use Z standard, and I think that's what Trina does as well, but I'll need to double check that.
Okay, I think it's a lot more reasonable if we are only doing this for new tables. I'm a little apprehensive to set the property in every table, but I mean, that just limits our ability to change it later. Yeah, we might want to do that at like a 2.x or something, but let me think about that. Sorry, I didn't mean to, shouldn't interrupt you.
Now that's more or less the primary thing. So if anyone has any concerns about those changes, let us know. There were a few others, but I need to look them up.
From our side, we want to get a fix in for the lazy snapshot loading. So basically, it's very easy to drop history when you're lazily loading snapshots, because the history, basically when the client receives a table metadata bundle, it will it'll rebuild the table metadata and attach the metadata file location to it. And what that does is it causes a trigger to like revalidate the table history. And if you've filtered the list of snapshots, we need to know not to validate the snapshots. Basically, don't go and remove the snapshots at all. Sorry, remove history for snapshots that aren't present, because the snapshots are still valid, they're just not there. So we're adding that, and we should have that fix in sometime in the next week or so. Anything else from the community on what we'd ideally like to get into 1.4? Probably not blockers, but you know, just what we'd like.
There are some changes on the view support, and I think Edward is there on the review, so if we can get a little bit more detail on that, that would be good. Like, what's the expectation for the 1.4 when it comes to
So
that?
I doubt that we're going to have views. I mean, what are we aiming for the 1.4 release in terms of timeline?
We were aiming end of this month to have the release candidate. So here's the milestone, and it does include some of the view related.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll actually add this. I don't know that we would. I don't know that we're going to be able to get much of the view stuff in. We've been going back and forth trying to get the REST catalog, sort of implementation and pieces there, and as just a first implementation. I think that that's been largely good. I would like to make sure that we're getting all of the API level changes in. But everything that we're working on, I believe right now, is not API facing. I'll go and review that stuff though.
Sounds good.
Because if we're trying to get it out sometime today or tomorrow, then I'll definitely go check.
That was the original timeline. I think we're like not realistic, but probably by the end of the next week to have a release candidate. That would be nice.
Okay, yeah, sounds great. All right, that's probably it for the 1.4 release. I'll also, I guess, yeah, let's hop to discussion topics. It looks like we have plenty of discussion, but if you'd like to add any other topics here, please go to the doc and suggest, or raise a hand, and we can get it added. If you either want to add something to the messages chat, or bring up a topic. But let's jump to table location ownership. Zihan?
Hey, guys. Yeah, so let me just explain the background of this a little bit, and then get into it. So I think the problem we're trying to solve is that we see a lot of users sometimes create tables on the same location, and then when they run remove orphan files, they would inadvertently destroy the other table. I think thinking through the problem, I mean, there's really no foolproof way to solve it unless your organization, I guess, owns the whole catalog. And then every time you create a table, you would check every other table and make sure, there's no conflicting location, which is not really possible in today's Java Iceberg library. So I think the first attempt to fix it, in my thought, was just to every time you create a table, you would check if that location exists, and then if it did, just don't allow table creation. So that would be one quick fix option I was debating. And then as I was kind of making progress towards that, I think Anton brought up that he had a long time ago brought up the concept of owned locations. I think I linked the initial PR initial GitHub discussion in the document if people are interested. And so own location is kind of a similar thing. Like when you create a table, you would check if that location exists, and then only if it doesn't exist, then you can add it to a location that you formerly own, or this table formerly owns. And then the effect of that is that when you run remove orphan files, you try to list prefixes to find files to delete. If you don't own that location, then you would just not delete files in that location. So it's kind of like similar thing to what I wanted to achieve, but I guess a more formal way. And then I guess there's benefits to adding that in the spec. That once we formalize the definition, we could probably use it. Initially, I'm thinking just to use it for remove orphan files, but we could potentially think to turn it on for other operations as well. Maybe expire snapshots don't delete files that are not in your own location. Like that won't be the first approach, but we could potentially expand it. And I guess as well, if we add it to the spec, then like different implementations of the Iceberg, like Python, Rust can also have opportunity to respect that field. So yeah, that's why it became kind of a bigger topic, and I just wanted to throw it out to the group to see if there was any thoughts on that. Obviously, there's a design doc we can discuss as well. Yeah, that's pretty much it for me.
I had just a couple questions about that. Like, I guess one question would be, you know, is there some reason people are sharing those table locations, or is it more like accidental that they just happen to point to the same path that like another table already exists at?
Yeah, it's more of a accidental thing that we notice people do. Like when they create tables in Spark, you can always specify a location, and then I guess people just like kind of clobber on each other.
Mm-hmm. So the other question was more about the owned locations, because I know we've talked about this concept of like identifying both like, hey, what is the primary or owned location for a table, and potentially other locations if it's split across multiple places. But don't you still end up like with orphan files, even the owned location, like some table is going to end up owning the location, and if somebody else drops files in there, like one of them is going to get stomped. Still, it may not be the first one that was created there, but it doesn't, unless you can actually go and look up and make sure that like, hey, somebody else doesn't own this location or something like that. You still kind of have this competing problem of, if I run orphan files, I would clobber like this other table that, you know, was handing data there.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I think like I said, the only foolproof solution, is like just doing a complete check, which is like kind of not very practical. I think in the current proposal, we have that if the location exists at the time you create table, then you just won't add it. Like we won't add it to the list of own locations. So if you say your first table created something on a location, started populating data, the second table, when it creates on that location, would see that there's already stuff there and then not add it to the own location.
So then it's not like safe to put data under that location, because like when that first table comes and does orphan files, it'll probably like pick up anything that you dropped in there. And I think that you know, there's still kind of some question about like, well, you know, how does that really help that situation? The check may be valid, and I think that Trino actually does that in some cases where it's like, hey, if you try and create a table on a location that already exists, it blows up. So there may be some, you know, some value in that with an override or something like that. Bryan?
I think that you're right, Dan, that this isn't going to solve everything. But I think that this is at least like the first step to solving the problem. You know, going and running and saying, okay, we're going to record location ownership. Like this table knows whether it owns a location. That at least gives you the confidence to say like, and with the, you know, the existence check, I think that gives us the ability to say only one table is going to own a location moving forward, which is, you know, way better than what we have today.
Yeah, I'm actually like, I'm all for adding table ownership and location ownership and like identifying locations where the table is modifying or adding data. I just wanted to be clear that like this doesn't solve the orphan file problem, especially if you're sharing locations.
Then we can move on to the next, right? So we could add a mode. So like there's ignore location ownership, right? That's what we do right now with orphan files. We could also add a mode that says, you know, only clean up orphan files if ownership is known. So if you don't have owned locations set in this table, you don't run orphan file cleanup, right? It just fails and says, no, I'm not going to do that. That would solve the problem that you're talking about, where if the table is pre-existing, we can't clean up its orphan files. But these are like administrator level settings, and so we would have to kind of know what you want to do.
Yeah, but I don't think that actually addresses it, because like even if it's like, hey, that was a pre-existing location, if I put data in there, it's very likely my data that I put in there will get stomped by whatever owned it originally. So there's still this competition of locations.
Well, what I'm saying is I'm assuming that you have, one version of Iceberg that is running orphan file cleanup, right? A service that runs across all tables. In that service, you can say, you can default to, like, if I don't know if I own this location, I don't. That way, that service would not run for any table that has not been created with the existence check. So it does allow us to sort of make progress on that, but then you have potentially thousands of tables that are not having orphan file cleanup happening. So it's safe, but you actually do need to go add, owned locations by deduplicating the location, and it's a bit of a pain, but you'd be able to at least have confidence and do a one-way update.
I'm still not entirely sure that I follow how that's safe, because if I have an existing table and it is doing orphan file cleanup, and then somebody else points a new table at that location, and it says, okay, well, I don't own that location, but I'm still going to use that location to put files in. Well, table 1's orphan file is going to blow up.
I'm saying table 1's orphan file cleanup does not own that location either. So you can detect that you don't own that location and not clean it up. The problem is then you have tables where you are the only table with a location, and you just don't know that you own it. So there's that trade-off. Do you want to continue stomping on other tables, or do you want to potentially leak files? The fix is, like Zion said, going through the metadata and cleaning it all up. Sorry, Stephen, you've had your hand up for a while.
So yeah, I still have the same concern as Dan had. So if we had one location shared by multiple tables, that means we cannot do the orphan file cleanup at table level. You can only do that at global level. Maybe looking at all the tables, find out all the files. Otherwise, yeah, just cannot do that cleanup at table level.
Yeah, you'd have to stop doing your orphan file on that original table, or it would have to switch over at the same time as everything else. So it's not doing orphan file cleanup of its table location if somebody else is like dropping files in there. So there is like a still a larger problem.
It's a hard problem for an administrator. I would also say that you probably want to fix how you're assigning table locations. By default, Hive creates a table location just based on the table name. I would definitely recommend changing how you're doing that assignment to use the table UID or something like that. That's what we do for our tables, and so we know that we always create a new location for a table, and so we sort of have this implicit ownership, at least in our catalog. I think Trino also does this, where they just generate a random UID and put it in the path when creating a table.
I think what Daniel and Steven were suggesting is that it's not really a problem with the overall approach, but it's a problem with the default behavior, because just checking if the location does not exist is probably not enough. It's not really about the table ownership concept as a whole. Like, for example, we can improve that default behavior to not only check the existence, but to check for the UID or to check for the table name at least, right? Because if we know that the table name or the location includes the table name, that gives us a little bit more confidence in that the location will not be shared, or like probably even better than the UID, for example. So I think it's more about how do we make sure the default behavior is safe, but overall have that like ownership concept, I think that may help. And like it probably will also evolve. I'm not sure. I haven't seen the design doc in full yet, but it will probably evolve once you change the data location or whatnot. So we can.
Yes. Yeah, so I think if I understand, like we will have different, like this concept is good, and then we could have different modes to dictate how the catalog respects this concept, like either like do a very complete check or not as complete check. Yes, go ahead, Wing Yu.
Oh yeah, I just have a question because I haven't had a chance to read the proposal either. But so if there are like permissive modes allowed, in others, like you can say I want to enable table location. So when you create your table, it's created with a location that you own. Then if somebody else is creating a table and they're allowed to create it without like saying they own the location, then in principle, they can also use your location, right? There's no enforcement to say, okay, you own this location, but is there any way to enforce that nobody else can write into your location?
Yeah, I think that's what Daniel was also bringing up. Yeah, so I think this is probably goes back to the modes. I don't know, as I understand, like we would probably have different modes that you can configure on the catalog to allow or disallow certain scenarios based on this.
Yeah,
So
you have
if we go back to the original problem, it seems like it's the unintentional sharing of table locations. And whether it's like, hey, people are copying SQL statements that already have a path in it, or they're using a name that's like a well-known name of like the prior existing table. I think the check to ensure that, hey, the path doesn't exist is a good approach to avoid that unintentional path sharing behavior. It's recommended that you use unique locations of some flavor so that people can create this without ever having to worry about it. But if you allow users to set paths, you probably want to prevent them from unintentionally like grabbing an existing path and then having all sorts of problems of like both data access as well as like the maintenance operations that can come in and destroy data behind the scenes. So I like the check. I think that there's lots of reasons for table ownership for other reasons too. So I think it's just a matter of like solidifying like what are we actually proposing, and what problems are those directly solving, because it seems like this is mostly unintentional behavior.
Yeah, it's just a departure from what the spec originally supported. When we added for Hive tables, when we added the UUID into the JSON files, that was actually to support these use cases. It was questionable whether we need them, but it's kind of a departure from where we were. It was possible to share the location, and now we would say that it's not.
I think it's still possible. It's just that we now have extra data about whether or not you're sharing, right? So if you wanted to say, put all of your data in a shared location, you could definitely do that. Iceberg certainly supports it. You can do that, but you would just not set the table ownership properties, right? And so this is really, I think this is a catalog or deployment level option, and that's certainly the way that we've treated it. Like I said, we generate a unique location per table so that we know the table owns its primary location. We also, allow pointing to secondary locations, but ownership is a bit more unclear. It's really up to the administrators, like how they manage paths in the underlying store.
And I think that if there are use cases where people are saying, hey, we would actually want to have two tables that coexist within the same path, like incorporating the ownership model and saying, hey, neither one of these tables actually owns this location. And then you can run in orphan files where we can say, hey, use the union of these two tables metadata paths in order to do that orphan file cleanup. The only problem there is like that doesn't go generically across. Like you have thousands of tables all sharing the same location. Like that could be like prohibitively hard to, union all of the metadata of all those tables, but you could possibly do it. I haven't seen a whole lot of use cases where people really actually want to share that table location.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in real world, what's a valid use case for sharing the location across tables?
So the best use case we know is, like S3's backend partitioning of the key space is not, it's dynamic, but it's not very responsive. So if you have a use case where you create a table and then you hit that prefix really, really hard, S3 is generally going to, return 503 errors because you have not allowed S3 the time to scale up to the size of the table. Our object storage layout at least gets to the point where once a table has enough data in it, you're generally like spreading out over backend prefixes. But the best argument for this is to use a shared, at least data location, so that you can have multiple tables keeping S3 generally busy, and shard across lots of backend S3 endpoints. I think it's still to be determined whether or not that's necessary. That certainly makes orphan file cleanup and a lot of these other use cases a lot harder. I don't know of anyone doing that in practice, but that's the general argument for it.
All right, thank you.
I do want to talk about the proposal just a little bit. I think we're all generally like, hey, yeah, let's clean this up. Despite our, discussion about like what actually improves or the limitations of the approach. The proposal uses a table property, which is nice in that it is backward compatible. So like older writers that don't know about this metadata would still preserve it, but this doesn't seem like a table property, a good use of table properties. This seems like, real metadata in the table metadata bundle. And so I at least want to consider, should we have a real list of paths that we add, like owned dash locations, which is a list inside the top level table metadata of, string fully qualified paths. I think that's the main decision point here.
Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense what you're saying. Yeah, right.
Okay, cool. So yeah, that's definitely what I would probably prefer. I don't think that this needs to be part of v3, but I think it would move from optional to required in v3. So this is a backward compatible change in that, forward compatible change in that older readers can interact with these tables just fine, right? You still have the problem of an older reader or older writer running orphan data files is gonna barf, but you just update your orphan data files. You also still have the problem of how do you upgrade to owned locations, because you would need all of your client versions to support this in order to preserve that metadata. But that's also something that the REST catalog solves, because you can update your REST catalog, and then that you're not actually stomping metadata structures that you don't know about. So I think that this is a compatible change and does not require v3.
Yeah.
Will it also help with the drop table issue? Because right now we don't know when we drop in the table whether we should drop the location. And if there are multiple locations, if the table is persists their data in multiple locations, it seems like if we had a reliable way to tell own location, then this would be something that would be used in the drop table as well. It's not only the remove orphan files. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is something where we should move all of the behavior to respect it. So basically say, if a file is not in an owned location, don't delete it.
So there's one other kind of relevant topic related to this that we might want to just make sure that we take into consideration if we're making changes here, which is the relative pathing discussion, because I think that there was also some overlap about table locations and how that might work with relative pathing.
That's actually the next topic.
Oh, okay, never mind.
Oh, sorry. Multi-arg transform was the next topic, but maybe we want to talk about table portability next. Yeah, YE.
嗨，这是先进it might be harder to pronounce my Chinese name. You may just call me advanced XY. I'd like to talk about multi-argument transform support in Iceberg. I think we are not present the stack.
Do you mind if we, let's cover this really quick because I think it was next on the list, and then we'll get back to table portability after that.
Okay.
Okay.
Currently, Iceberg doesn't support transform with multiple arguments. However, it's quite common and useful to include the multiple argument transform, such as bucket transform or zero transform or geo-partition transforms. So I'd like to propose a spec change to include the argument transform. The current constraint about single argument transform is that we can okay. Let me talk about a bit about current bucket transform. If we can request multiple bucket data transform on multiple data columns for current version. It's possible to simply add multiple bucket transforms to more than one column in the current version Iceberg. It could be illustrated as follows: bucket number column 1 and column 2. It will be divided into two bucket transform, such as bucket M column 1 and the bucket N column 2, where P is M multiple N. The current approach has the advantage of allowing the partition specs of column 1 and column 2 to evolve independently. However, disadvantage of this approach would be P cannot be a prime number. The optimal combination of M and N cannot be easily determined, and it requires manual tuning. It doesn't scale well for more columns, and compared to multi-column bucketing, it might be able to distribute some unbalanced data, and even it might not able to disable more unbalanced data evenly. So it would be nice to support multi-argument transform, especially for bucket transform. The proposed change is listed in the documentation. I would appreciate your input and comments.
Anton?
It seems to be fairly useful. I think there's a lot of use cases where we supported. I think geo partition transforms take multiple inputs, Z ordering, few others. I'll need to read a little bit more about the custom bucket function. I know Hive supports it, but I'll need to double check what are the benefits of it compared to using it on two columns. I'm not up to speed there, but it seems very valuable. I think we've talked about this in the past. It's just a question how to represent that. I think the biggest change would be in the expression API, because most of the expressions and transforms, they kind of expect a single input. So that would be probably the biggest challenge I see.
I already did a POC of how Spark supports multi-argument bucket transform. You can check my initial PR in the last of the document. I think the expression part is straightforward. However, I think how to make it forward compatible change is the most complicated part. We can simply add multi-argument transform. However, we should make sure all the version of reader can read the data correctly or throw an exception.
I have a quick. I think this is really cool. I think in the POC, I just had a quick question. I was thinking it would be kind of hard to support the predicate pushdown partition filter pushdown once you have two. I don't know. Did you handle that in the PR, or was that something like still to do?
Partition predict down would be the same as how system function down is handled. I think I didn't handle it specifically, but I don't think it would be hard.
I was just thinking, like in this case, then you would need to check like if the filter has both the columns, then you would need to transform that value to the partition. I was thinking that would be hard, but maybe I haven't walked through it. I was just wondering if that was tested.
I think in the Spark, at least in the Spark set, we could at the projection. Let me rephrase it. As required. But, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I was just. I'll probably look more in the PR and comment.
Yeah, I think that this design doc is really great. Thank you for putting it together, and thanks for being so thorough, especially with things like how do older clients actually continue interacting with tables and things like that. So, things like setting the source ID to -1 because older clients are going to consider that a required field, and that sort of thing. So I definitely appreciate the care with which you've taken here, and to make sure you do this. There are a couple things like Anton said. I think that the actual transform classes will need to change a bit, and it's a little unclear. I agree with you that the expression library should be fairly straightforward. And to Zihan's point, it may be a little more difficult to do pushdown if you have to detect something like column A equals 1 and column B equals 2 if you're bucketed on columns A and B. Then the last thing, I mean, but we actually could just release without any pushdown for multi-column bucketed fields and add that sort of advanced thing later. So I think that this is about ready to go. We are going to have probably a few more questions here. My big question spec-wise, not implementation, is can we add additional information? So currently we allow parameterizing bucket with a single number. And we pass that through as an argument. But for things like z-ordering, it would be really nice to have normalization values. So this is like the trouble with z-order is if you have different magnitudes of the values you're z-ordering, z-order doesn't do anything. So if you have one column that's clustered around 0 and one column that's clustered around 10,000, then z-ordering is always going to favor ordering by the 10,000 column rather than the 0 column. And what we need to do is basically turn those into z-score functions using like a normal distribution or something like that. So the question I have here is, can we actually express those the mean and standard deviation for computing a z-score or something like that in these transforms? Russell?
Something that I've actually been thinking about as well is what if we have like maybe an order of magnitude more information that we want to store about the partition transforms, like not just staying at that level, but say we have we've been talking a lot about like ranged-based partitioning transforms, where that transform itself has maybe a megabyte of domain information. So it's like 0 through 1,000 goes in one partition, the next one is 1,001 through 5,004 or whatever, and we just have this rather large blob that's actually associated with the partition transform. So I was kind of wondering if we want to even keep that outside of metadata.json, Because for most readers, they can either use it or not use it, because if you can't do partition evaluation, like that's always fine. You can just read all the files and check file level limits. But for those that do support that, they could read this extra file and maybe perform even better things, better filtering.
Do you really think that it would be up to a megabyte of
Yeah, so
per ranges?
I have a specific example. So we've been talking with a lot of maps teams, and they do a grid over the entire planet, and it comes out to about 10 megabytes. And with that, they get partition ranges where they can get about 128 megabytes in a single partition with that full 10 megabyte range mapping. So that's my biggest imagined one, and I would love to support that.
I'm curious as to whether that is a legit range or if that's just something that you should calculate outside of Iceberg. But that's probably debatable. I think we do want to support at least like simple range partitioning, right? With 30 to 100 values or something like that. So that's definitely another thing that we should keep in mind here. So maybe it's just, you know, how we represent all that additional information going into the transforms.
Yeah, I worry about keeping it all in metadata, Jason, because I do think it may be non-trivial, and I still think about the future of having this dynamic enough that maybe it changes on every write or something like that. Something where we have, you know, a very flexible partitioning where we're keeping like a different transform for maybe every day or every week or whatever, and that gets compacted later or something like that.
It's probably like sort of dynamic partitioning, which can evolve if like you have a background service that checks if you have, for example, imbalanced partitions. I think that would be the closest one, and then it would split the ranges of the partitions. You can do that with the range or with the grouping transform of that sort. But I think there are two probably separate issues. One is how to support multi-argument transforms that we know how to evaluate. And maybe there's also another question about, there are a lot of different geospatial curves in indexing. There is no standard. There are a lot of, so we cannot pick one in Iceberg. So it probably opens another discussion whether it should be possible to somehow plug in those custom transform functions into Iceberg tables. I mean, the simplest way would be to support, let's say, like you would store a point to a Java class, but that has like a lot of issues. So like ideal would find something better, but it's probably a question, how do you plug in like a custom transform into an Iceberg table and whether that's possible?
Yeah, you could definitely do that through a custom transform. Russell, I think we could also meet your use case by having a transformation that references a data file. So it's, you know, metadata actually looks like, you know, run this histogram range kind of thing with column A, column B, and this supplementary data file.
Yeah, I think those things kind of make sense. I mean, for all of our range applications, we just need something like that. Even for the geospatial, if we're having a curve that we're fitting in or Z order, it's only really useful if we can say this Z value goes in this partition. If we can't do that, we just end up sorting files all day long.
Yeah. Okay.
So in the current spec, like there's no way to custom transform today, but if I understand that there is kind of like general willingness to consider that as an option. Is that correct?
I think that that's a very separate discussion from the multi-argument transforms, and I think this is definitely something that we should, you know, tackle. But yes, I think that there's willingness, and I think that we can also do a fairly good job of doing predicate pushdown with those transforms as well, because I think it really comes down to you know, two modes. Like, is this a monotonic transformation or is it a, you know, more random transformation. So like, yeah, I think that we can solve those challenges for plugging in custom transformations. How to do that and not make it Java specific is, you know, a little bit more debatable.
Yeah. Sorry.
Quick update. We're at noon, but do we still want to try to tackle the the portability issue, or is it?
I think we should probably table that until next time, if that's all right. Because that, I think table portability could easily be another 15 or 20-minute discussion. But
okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Oh, and next steps on the timestamp and timestamp TZ with consensus. I would say take this multi-argument transform document as a really good example of a proposal that handles the issues of how do we add or change the spec, and, you know, build a proposal around it.